All of our presidents, just like all world leaders, have been men of controversy, whether earned or not. Some were incompetent, others well-meaning, and a few just evil in nature, and in this series, we let you decide after providing the evidence. Andrew Jackson was always controversial, both loved and hated during his lifetime, and those opinions still exist today. We will examine his heroics and questionable activities, which even by today's standards may appear to be quite brutal. Who was Andrew Jackson? How did he rise from humble beginnings to the heights of power? What were his major controversies? What is his legacy? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767, in Waxhaw, South Carolina. Jackson was born into extreme poverty and did not have a formal education. As a boy, the American Revolution came to his area and fighting raged from 1780 to 1781, and his family suffered, his mother and two brothers dying. At age 13, Jackson was taken prisoner, and he ran afoul of a British officer who cut him with a saber after he defiantly refused to shine his boots. For the rest of his life, he hated the British, a hatred he would carry for the rest of his life. He taught himself to read, and after the Revolution, he studied law at Salisbury, North Carolina, and was admitted to the bar in 1787. And the following year, he became the prosecuting attorney of the Western District of North Carolina, which soon after became the state of Tennessee, settling in Nashville. For almost 30 years, Jackson was allied with this group in Tennessee politics. Jackson boarded in the home of Colonel John Donaldson, where he met and married the colonel's daughter, Rachel Robards. Jackson was elected as the first representative from the new state of Tennessee to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1796, and he served one term and refused to run for re-election. But he did run for a seat in the U.S. Senate and won, but he resigned a year later. Soon after his return to Nashville, he was elected Major General of the Tennessee Militia in 1802, a position he still held when the War of 1812 opened the door to a command in the field and a hero's role. He then became a judge in the Tennessee State Supreme Court and served in that post until 1804. In March 1812, Jackson issued a call for 50,000 volunteers to be ready for an invasion of Canada, as he saw war with Great Britain coming. After the declaration of war by Congress in June 1812, Jackson offered his services and those of his militia to the United States. When Jackson was given a command, it was to fight against the Creek Indians, who were at that time allied with the British, who were threatening the southern frontier. In a campaign lasting only 5 months, from 1813 to 1814, Jackson completely destroyed the Creeks at the Battle of Topeka, called Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. In August 1814, Jackson moved his army south to Mobile, Alabama, and was without specific instructions, but his real objective was the Spanish post at Pensacola. His motive was to prepare the way for the U.S. occupation of Florida, which was then a Spanish possession. Jackson's reasoning was that Spain and Great Britain were allies at that time in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Jackson learned that British troops had landed at Pensacola. In November, he led his army into Florida, and on November 7th, occupied Pensacola when the British evacuated it to go by sea to Louisiana. Jackson then marched his army overland to New Orleans, arriving in December. He made powerful allies and often stayed with Jean-Bernard de Marigny de Mandeville, a powerful politician known for his playboy lifestyle. He also made an alliance with the pirate brothers Jean and Pierre Lafitte, who provided troops, scouts, and much-needed gunpowder. One Jean Humbert, who had served in the French Revolutionary Army, was part of Jackson's staff. Humbert had fled to New Orleans after it was discovered that he was having an affair with Pauline Bonaparte, the wife of his commanding officer, Charles Leclerc. Jackson also had ad hoc militias from Kentucky and Tennessee, as well as buccaneers, smugglers, and Choctaw Indians within his ranks, as well as Creole and Anglo-American militia. The Americans had fought a few small battles which were mostly unplanned contacts. Jackson also ordered martial law in New Orleans and held it until he had confirmation that the war was over. On December 14th, the British defeated the small American fleet at Lake Borgne, and 9 days later, they landed and took Jackson by surprise. Jackson decided to attack, but he took heavy casualties, but the British also took casualties and could not advance. Jackson was able to fall back to the Chalmette line, 5 miles downriver from New Orleans, which was very defensible. The British plan was to capture New Orleans at all costs. Jackson's mission was to see that did not happen. The British had very few options, as the bayous were full of alligators and poisonous snakes, preventing a flanking on foot, and movement by boat was a problem due to the small number of boats available. Likewise, a formal siege was not possible given British logistics and lack of cannon, and illness was also rampant in the British ranks. Jackson's hastily organized defense proved adequate despite being heavily outnumbered, and the British attacked on January 8, 1815, and they suffered heavy losses, forcing them to withdraw. What Jackson and the British did not know for certain was that the war was already over, although rumors did persist, and news of Jackson's great victory followed the news of the signing of the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814. Jackson, hearing of the treaty, knew that Congress had to ratify it, so he maintained martial law, even executing 6 of his own men for desertion. In fact, Louisiana State Senator Louis Louvalier wrote an unsigned article in the Louisiana Courier that criticized Jackson for not returning civilian authority. In return, Jackson had him jailed. U.S. District Court Judge Dominic A. Hall signed a writ of habeas corpus for the imprisoned senator, and for his trouble he, too, was jailed. A military court exonerated Louvalier, but Jackson ignored the verdict and kept the politician detained. Such was his personality. The Battle of New Orleans had made Jackson a national hero, and he was appointed commander of the Southern District. The locals lauded him as a modern Caesar. Jackson decided to take leave, and he entrusted the command of the troops in the field to his subordinates while he retired to his home at the Hermitage near Nashville. But he was brought back to active duty at the end of December 1817, as there were revolts by Native Americans along the southeast border. Jackson had no specific orders, so on his own initiative he invaded Florida and captured 2 Spanish posts and appointed one of his subordinates as the military governor of Florida. He captured the Spanish forts at St. Mark's, Pensacola, and several other towns, and claimed the surrounding territory for the United States, also capturing 2 British subjects, Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, and he had them hanged. The Spanish, somewhat upset, filed a diplomatic complaint from Spain, precipitating a cabinet crisis in Washington. Jackson was defended by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who almost single-handedly saved Jackson from censure and hastened the U.S. acquisition of Florida. Jackson at first had no plans for continuing a political career, but the people of Tennessee in 1822 convinced the Tennessee legislature to nominate him as a candidate for president. The next year, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. The 1824 election had 4 candidates receiving electoral votes. Jackson received the highest number of 99. The others receiving electoral votes were John Quincy Adams, who received 84, William H. Crawford, 41, and Henry Clay, 37. Because no one had a majority, the House of Representatives was required to elect a president from the 3 with the highest number of votes. Adams was elected on the first ballot. When Adams appointed Clay Secretary of State, it seemed to admirers of Jackson to confirm the rumors of a corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. Jackson, seeing underhanded activities, became a candidate again in 1828. In 1828, Jackson defeated Adams by an electoral vote of 178 to 83 after a campaign in which personalities and slander played a larger part than in any previous U.S. national election. One of the great slanders was that Jackson and his wife Rachel Robards, despite their long marriage, had been vilified in campaign pamphlets as adulterers. The basis was that Rachel Jackson was not legally divorced from her first husband, hence the name Robards, at the time she and Jackson were wed. When they discovered their mistake, they remarried, but the damage had been done. Rachel died at the Hermitage on December 22, 1828. Jackson had these words inscribed on her tombstone, quote, "A being so gentle and yet so virtuous, slander might wound but could not dishonor." Rachel had dreaded becoming the hostess of the president's house, saying that she would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than live in that place. Nonetheless, the election of 1828 is often considered a major turning point in the political history of the United States. Jackson himself once said, "I know what I am fit for. I can command a body of men in a rough way, but I am not fit to be president." Yet today he is regarded as the maker of the modern presidency, founder of the Democrat Party. When Jackson was inaugurated on March 4, 1829, it was the first time in more than a quarter of a century that the election of a new president reflected the repudiation of his predecessor. Jackson's election brought him into office, and despite his short terms in the House and Senate, outside of being a military commander, he had no foreign policy experience. But Jackson was also a very ill man when he became president. Jackson was in fact a tyrant. He made it clear that he would conduct business as he saw fit, despite his cabinet appointments, becoming known as King Andrew I. In making decisions and policy, Jackson relied on an informal group of newspaper editors and politicians who had helped elect him, and they became to be known as his kitchen cabinet. During his 2 terms as president, Jackson removed fewer than 1/5 of all federal office holders. Many of his friends who assisted him had hoped to get positions in his administration, but Jackson, to his credit, kept those people he thought were useful and competent. But Andrew Jackson's illness was quite obvious, and many did not believe he would live out his term. So people looked to a successor, such as his vice president, John C. Calhoun, also from South Carolina, and the other option was the Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren. Also in 1829, the state of Georgia extended its jurisdiction to 9 million acres of land still occupied by the Cherokee Indians, who actually still held legal title. But when gold was discovered, Georgia was in violation of the treaty with the United States and the Cherokee. The Cherokee appealed to the federal courts. In 2 separate cases, the Supreme Court ruled against Georgia in favor of the Cherokee, but Georgia ignored those decisions and continued to enforce its jurisdiction within the territory claimed by the Cherokees, often violently. Jackson, never a friend to Native American tribes, made no effort to restrain Georgia, as there were still rumors about Jackson's health. This was when John C. Calhoun was courted as the obvious successor. But Calhoun himself was no friend of Jackson's, as he had wanted Jackson to be censured for his invasion of Florida, which Jackson learned about only in 1830, so Van Buren seemed to be his successor should he fail to serve his 2nd term. Jackson had serious enemies, especially as the election of 1832 approached, since Jackson's opponents hoped to embarrass him due to the charter of the Bank of the United States, which was due to expire in 1836 during his term. Few presidential vetoes have caused as much controversy in their time or later as the one Jackson sent to Congress on July 10, 1832. The veto of the bill to recharter the bank was the prelude to a conflict over financial policy that continued through Jackson's 2nd term, which he nevertheless won easily. Efforts to persuade Congress to enact legislation limiting the circulation of banknotes failed, but there was one critical point at which Jackson was free to apply his theories. Jackson issued the Specie Circular in July 1836, which required payment in gold or silver for all public lands, as he was not a fan of paper money. Many of the banks could not compete and began to fail, and the effect of bank failures in the West soon spread to the East. Jackson needed money and wanted to impose tariffs, especially on South Carolina, to raise revenue due to its massive agricultural produce and exports, which in 1832 required congressional leaders to seek a compromise in the form of a moderate reduction of the tariff. South Carolina adopted a resolution declaring the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void, and prohibiting the enforcement of either within its boundaries after February 1, 1833. Pressed, Jackson agreed to a tariff reduction. But Jackson accepted the challenge, denounced the theory of nullification, and asked Congress for authority to send troops into South Carolina to enforce the law. On March 1, 1833, Congress sent Jackson two companion bills to reduce the tariff duties on many items, and the Force Bill, which empowered the president to use the armed forces to enforce federal laws. South Carolina repealed nullification, but also declared the Force Act null and void. One of his greatest opponents was the abolitionist movement, who detested him. Jackson faced the first real possibility of a civil war and a secession of states over this issue of tariffs, and slavery was on the back burner. But the Georgia problem with the Cherokee still existed, and Jackson's failure to support the Supreme Court remains an indelible stain on his record. This is just one example of Jackson's policies against the American Indian when white settlers wanted their lands. Jackson invoked the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and granted the Indian tribes unsettled western prairie land in exchange for their homelands. The Cherokee were forced to sign another treaty in 1835, giving up their land in exchange for land in the Indian Territory west of Arkansas. 3 years later, General Winfield Scott forcibly removed some 15,000 Cherokees who were forced westward on what became known as the Trail of Tears during the cold and wet winter, and nearly a quarter of them died of starvation, illness, and exposure. The greatest resistance came from the Seminoles in Florida, which would not be concluded until the end of the savage Second Seminole War of 1835 to 1842. They were forced as far west as Arkansas and Texas. Jackson's policies overall were well received, and he left office more popular than when he entered it. His decisions exercised a profound effect on the character of U.S. politics for half a century. His success appeared to be a vindication of the new democracy and his party. Jackson was also a fervent supporter of slavery, which was adopted by his new Democratic Party, and the intensity of the political struggles from 1825 to 1837 led to the revival of the two-party system. It also sowed the seeds for the future Civil War. Andrew Jackson was himself a slave owner and seemed to have no issue with the institution, and he insisted that those he hired to manage the farm treat my Negroes with humanity. Slavery was also the primary source of Jackson's personal wealth, and he wanted to protect his assets. When he wrote to Graves W. Steele, the overseer accused of causing an enslaved man's death at the Hermitage, he demanded a full account of your guardianship with the loss of my property. Jackson ordered harsh, even brutal punishment for enslaved people who disobeyed orders. When an enslaved woman named Betty was judged to be guilty of some improper conduct, he wrote to his overseer that she must be ruled with the cowhide and should be given 50 lashes the next time she misbehaved. When an enslaved man ran away from the Hermitage, the punishment was even more extreme. He put an advertisement in the Tennessee Gazette that promised a reward for the man's return, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300, which would almost certainly have killed the runaway slave. This choice of language suggests that he cared more about the financial impact of the death than he did about the man's life. Jackson did sometimes live up to paternalistic ideals. The enslaved people he owned could not leave his property without his consent, had no access to education, and worked long hours with no pay. Jackson also brought several of his slaves to Washington to serve in the White House. One story was that George, an enslaved man and the son of longtime Hermitage cook Old Hannah, served as Andrew Jackson's manservant. He was in his early 20s when Jackson brought him to the White House. He slept in the president's bedroom on a pallet next to his bed so that he was accessible anytime Jackson needed him. A manservant was always on call with no real time off. Faithfully, George remained at the president's side for decades, whether he wanted to or not. When Jackson died in 1845, George was standing next to his sickbed. Andrew Jackson was definitely a man of his times, prudent when required, ruthless when necessary, but always certain of his actions. He rarely hesitated to take decisive action regardless of the controversy, hence earning the nickname Old Hickory. Andrew Jackson died on June 8, 1845 at his home, the Hermitage, now Nashville, Tennessee. Every American knows about Abraham Lincoln, lawyer, politician, president, and icon of freedom. Or do they? Lincoln ascended to the presidency during the darkest period
in our history and faced challenges no other president had before or since. In this two-part presentation, we will examine the highlights of some of his successes, mistakes, and illegal actions. The Civil War pitted the nation against each other, and its origins were not what most people believe. Lincoln's greatest challenge was keeping the Union together at any cost, and sometimes he may have gone too far. But before we cast a large shadow over all of Lincoln's decisions, especially those that appear egregious historically, we must first understand his evolution as a man, politician, and attorney, as well as president. We have to look into why he became an anti-slavery president, but also examine the time in which he lived and the situation thrust upon him of a divided nation tearing itself apart. But did he go too far in trying to preserve the Union, violating the very Constitution he claimed to revere and swore to protect? Who was the real Abraham Lincoln? Why and how did he evolve and adopt an anti-slavery position? What did he do that was illegal under the Constitution? When did the issue of slavery become his focal point to rally the nation in the cause of freedom, and why?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, at Sinking Spring Farm in rural Hodgenville, Kentucky, to parents Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln. In 1817, they moved to Perry County, Indiana, due to a land dispute over their farm. In Indiana, the family squatted on public land in a crude shelter, hunting game and farming a small plot which they eventually bought. When Lincoln was 9 years old, his 34-year-old mother died of tremetel, more commonly known as milk sickness, on October 5, 1818, which devastated him. Afterward, his father placed even more physical responsibility on him, and his education suffered. In December 1819, Lincoln's father, Thomas, married Sarah Bush Johnston, a Kentucky widow with 3 children of her own, whom Lincoln bonded with. She encouraged him to read and continue learning, which he did with a passion. His entire formal education period lasted only about a year and a half. He would walk for several miles to borrow or return a book. He was mostly self-taught in reading, literature, math, science, but he loved history and law. In March 1830, the family moved to Macon County, Illinois. A short time later, again to Coles County. It was there that the 22-year-old Lincoln decided to leave, making a living as a manual laborer, specializing in cutting down trees, splitting firewood, and building log cabin homes. All the while, he continued to read and learn. Lincoln later moved to the small town of New Salem, Illinois, where over time he worked as a shopkeeper, local postmaster, and eventually becoming a general store owner. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, thin but very muscular, Lincoln became an excellent wrestler in order to make money. During his 12 years wrestling, he only had one recorded loss to Hank Thompson in 1832. The shopkeeper Lincoln worked for in New Salem, Illinois, arranged his matches to promote his business. Lincoln became a well-known celebrity when he defeated local champion Jack Armstrong. In fact, Lincoln's record saw him posthumously given the National Wrestling Hall of Fame's Outstanding American Award in 1992. When the Black Hawk War broke out in 1832 between the United States and the Native Americans, the volunteers elected Lincoln to be their captain, although he saw no combat during this time. But it did emphasize upon him the rigors and challenges of leadership. When he returned, he planned on becoming a blacksmith, but decided to form a partnership with 21-year-old William Berry, and they purchased a New Salem general store on credit. Berry obtained bartending licenses for $7 each for Lincoln and himself due to the law requiring a license for selling individual spirits. and in 1833, the Lincolnbury General Store became a tavern as well. When Berry became an alcoholic and ineffective as a partner, Lincoln ended up managing by himself. Although the local economy was booming, the business struggled and went into debt, causing Lincoln to sell his share. Lincoln's passion for the law was always present. He taught himself law by reading William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, the U.S. Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the writings of all the Founding Fathers, especially lawyers such as John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. In 1834, he was elected to the Illinois State Legislature as a member of the Whig Party. He was a supporter of government-sponsored infrastructure and protective tariffs. His views on slavery became well known, as he did not believe so much that it was a moral wrong, but that it was detrimental to economic development. Lincoln was never an open abolitionist during these years, and that was well established. But he did see the need to have the law protect all people, and did believe that even those in slavery had rights. He also agreed that slavery was a 10th Amendment issue and that the federal government could not intervene as a result. After years of self-study and passing the rigorous examinations, he was admitted to the bar in 1837 and joined the John T. Stewart law firm in Springfield, Illinois, as a junior attorney. During this period, he met and became romantically involved with Anne Rutledge. Before they became officially engaged, Anne died at age 22 of typhoid fever in New Salem. Following that year, he met Mary Owens, and they saw each other for a few months, and marriage was considered, but Lincoln changed his mind. On August 16, 1837, he wrote her a letter saying, quote, he would not blame her if she ended the relationship, and he never received a response. However, due to this loss and the fact that there was not really enough work for him there, he followed the circuit court around the state representing clients. On November 4, 1842, Lincoln married Mary Todd, an opinionated, high-spirited, and well-educated woman from a distinguished family in Kentucky. She was the daughter of Robert Smith Todd, a wealthy lawyer and businessman in Lexington. Together, they would have 4 sons: Robert Todd, Edward Baker, William Wallace, and Thomas, known as Tad. Robert, who was born in 1843, was the only child to live to adulthood. He then partnered with William Herndon in 1844, and he made a good living as a defense and contract attorney. From 1847 to 1849, he was elected and served one term in the U.S. House of Representatives as the lone Whig Party member from Illinois, but he was unable to gather political allies. While in Congress, he opposed the Mexican-American War and President James K. Polk's support of it. He supported the Wilmot Proviso, a failed proposal to ban slavery in any U.S. territory won from Mexico, becoming one of the few doves surrounded by hawks. These positions made him unpopular back home, and then he also supported Zachary Taylor for president in 1848. Not having a lot of political support, Lincoln decided not to run for a second term due to his unpopularity and returned to Springfield to practice law. Lincoln saw an opportunity during the 1850s as railroads started their great expansion, and he served as a lobbyist for the Illinois Central Railroad and was its company attorney. He also represented riverboat companies, and he was not partisan. He believed that if a case had merits, it should be taken and the client represented. He also represented a bridge company against a riverboat company in Heard v. Rock Island Bridge Company, a landmark case involving a canal boat that sank after hitting a bridge. Knowing a bit about riverine maritime requirements and the dangers facing the boat crews, he received a patent for a flotation device in 1849. This allowed for the movement of boats in shallow water. The idea was never sold on the commercial market due to cost, but it made Lincoln the only president to hold a patent. His fame as a successful criminal and corporate attorney brought him many new clients, including banks, insurance companies, and manufacturing firms. But in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise. This event set the precedent for Lincoln to consider politics. This ruling was sponsored by Lincoln's friend and friendly rival Stephen Douglas, allowing the electorates of individual states and territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery under the 10th Amendment's protection, rather than a strict prohibition as a requirement. The law provoked violent opposition in Kansas and Illinois, to which Lincoln was a keen observer, and this issue gave rise to the modern Republican Party. Lincoln's opposition was well noted when he said the Kansas Act had a declared indifference, but as I must think a covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate it. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of just influence in the world. Lincoln's position on slavery, while not outright abolitionist in the extreme, was at least moderate to want to stop its expansion until it died a natural death. He also had the support of the anti-slavery Democrats, and after failing to win the majority for his Senate race after 4 rounds, Lincoln instructed his backers to vote for Lyman Trumbull, then leading anti-slavery Democrat. This coalition allowed for the defeat of the mainstream pro-slavery Democratic candidate Joel Aldrich Madison. In 1856, Lincoln not only joined, but he also helped shape the new Republican Party, and his concepts on slavery were changing. He was dealing with the moral struggle that the people of the country were having with the institution of keeping others in bondage, but he also knew that it was a states' right issue, not federal. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued its monumental and controversial Dred Scott decision, declaring that blacks were not citizens and had no inherent rights and were in fact property. Although Lincoln, like most white people, felt that black people were not their equal, he still believed America's founders intended that all men were created with certain inalienable rights, even if they were owned as property. Lincoln decided to challenge the sitting U.S. Senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, his friend, for his seat. Douglas and Lincoln were actually friends who both highly respected each other. They often had dinners together and played cards. This was lost upon the public who watched the two men hack at each other, but in a professional and in debatable manner, they appeared to be quite friendly. It was said that after the debates, which often lasted several hours, the two men would get together, have dinner, and try to determine who had the best argument that day. In his GOP nomination acceptance speech, Lincoln seemed to alter his position on slavery to a more lenient stance. He criticized Douglas, who sponsored the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Supreme Court who upheld it, and President James Buchanan for promoting slavery, then declared a house divided cannot stand. During his 1858 U.S. Senate campaign, he participated in 7 debates against Douglas, when they held in different cities across Illinois. The debates became heated and legendary, covering issues such as states' rights, Western expansion, per the Monroe Doctrine, and the greatest issue of the day, slavery. These laid the groundwork for the forthcoming presidential election. Some Eastern Republicans supported Douglas for his opposition to the Lecompton Constitution and admission of Kansas as a slave state. Lincoln was well known to be in opposition. For the first time, Illinois Republicans held a convention to agree upon a Senate candidate, and Lincoln won the nomination with little opposition. The local and even national newspapers followed these events, and most had their partisan slant. Lincoln's anti-slavery position did not sit well with the majority of newspapers, even with a few Republicans and the majority of Democrats, and he received a lot of negative press, and as a result, Douglas won. However, it catapulted Lincoln onto the national stage. In May 1859, Lincoln purchased the Illinois Staatsanzeiger, a German-language newspaper that was consistently supportive, despite the fact that most of the state's 130,000 German Americans voted for Democrats. But the German-language paper mobilized Republican support for Lincoln due to the anti-slavery issue. As Lincoln was campaigning, he was still practicing law, and while defending William Duff Armstrong, who was on trial for the murder of James Preston Metzger, his case became famous for Lincoln's use of a fact established by judicial notice to challenge the credibility of an eyewitness. A witness in the case claimed that he could identify Lincoln's client Armstrong because of the intense light from a full moon. Lincoln referred to a farmer's almanac and proved that the night in question had been too dark for the witness to see anything clearly, and his client was acquitted. The following year, Lincoln had another high-profile case. Simeon Quinn Peachy Harrison was a third cousin to himself, and he was also the grandson of Lincoln's political opponent, Reverend Peter Cartwright. Harrison was charged with the murder of Greig Crafton, who, as he lay dying of his wounds, confessed to Cartwright that he had provoked Harrison, and it was a case of self-defense. The judge in the case, a well-known Democrat, excluded Cartwright's testimony about the confession as inadmissible hearsay. Lincoln argued that the testimony involved a dying declaration and was not subject to the hearsay rule. Most of the court observers expected the judge, who was not a political ally of Lincoln's, to hold him in contempt of court. However, surprising everyone, the judge reversed his ruling and admitted the testimony into evidence, resulting in Harrison being acquitted. As a result of these two high-profile murder cases, handled while he was running in a primary election cycle, Lincoln was regarded as one of the best attorneys in the state, and the very high-profile murder cases tended to prove that. Lincoln also appeared before the Illinois State Supreme Court in 175 appellate cases, and he was sole counsel in 51 of these cases, and 31 were decided in his favor. From 1853 to 1860, one of his largest clients was still the Illinois Central Railroad, but his willingness to represent poor clients against serious charges gave him good public press. As a result, his reputation as a lawyer to all men, regardless of wealth or status, and due to his being a stickler on legal protocol, earned him the nickname of Honest Abe. Due to his fame as a lawyer, he developed a high political profile. GOP political operatives in Illinois organized a campaign in 1860 to support Lincoln for the presidency. On May 18th, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln was selected over even better-known Republican candidates such as William Seward of New York and Salmon P. Chase of Ohio. Lincoln's nomination was partly due to his moderate views on slavery. While not advocating for a total abolition due to the 10th Amendment, he did argue for basic human rights for slaves. Also helping his candidacy was his support for improving the national infrastructure, expanding railroads, education for children, and the protective tariff. But Lincoln was still perceived as a fence-sitter on the issue of slavery. Horace Greeley, then editor of the New York Tribune, illustrated Lincoln's willingness to compromise on the issue of slavery, as well as his reluctance to challenge the Dred Scott decision, and these were used against him by his political opponents. The November 1860 general election was at the time the political equivalent of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and Lincoln faced his old friend and rival, Stephen Douglas, once again. The election was a four-way race that included John C. Breckinridge of the Northern Democrats and John Bell of the Constitution Party. Lincoln received just under 40% of the popular vote as it was spread among all the candidates, but he secured 180 of 303 Electoral College votes to win the election. This was also when he began growing his legendary beard. The times were changing for the United States, and Lincoln would find himself leading a nation that was tearing itself apart at the seams. The situations he would face would force him to make some decisions that, even by today's standards, still shocked the American people. We will see in Part 2 how Lincoln, the legal mind, defender of the poor and rich alike, and constitutional supporter, would slowly evolve, perhaps out of desperation or what he perceived to be necessity, to make decisions that would challenge his integrity on many constitutional issues due to his actions. Lincoln's selection for his cabinet showed his ability to look beyond politics, and these selections would greatly benefit him during his first term. They included many of his political rivals, including William Seward as Secretary of State, Salmon P. Chase as Secretary of the Treasury, who was instrumental in establishing the national banking system and issuing paper currency, and later the Chief Supreme Court Justice, Edward Bates, as Attorney General, and Simon Cameron as Secretary of War. However, in January 1862, due to many complaints regarding pilfering, inefficiency, and profiteering at government expense in the War Department, Lincoln replaced Cameron with Edwin Stanton. Stanton reorganized and centralized the War Department's spending and procurement methods, creating mandatory auditing, accountability, and canceling bad contracts and negotiating better ones. Stanton's efforts saved the federal government $17 million, or $500 million, in 2023 currency. Stanton, a conservative Democrat, became Lincoln's most reliable cabinet member and someone he could rely upon. Southern states had been talking about secession for some time, and despite the prevailing myth, these disagreements had very little to do with slavery. Scholars disagree over the causes of the war, and disagreements persist today. Many maintain that the primary cause of the war was the Southern states' desire to preserve the institution of slavery. Others minimize slavery and point to other factors, such as taxation or the principle of states' rights. The North's reluctance to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, mandating that fugitive slaves be returned to the South, was a big issue, despite the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Another factor was that the Southern states were selling their cotton and tobacco crops to Europe at good prices. This placed Northern textile owners having to compete with the overseas markets, especially Great Britain, as the Southern states produced about 75% of the world's cotton. The Southern states also produced over 80% of the world's tobacco. Both commodities were the envy of the Northern industrialists, and Southerners feared a federal intervention hampering their selling their produce overseas, with placing export protection tariffs on them. This would make it too expensive to not sell to the North at far cheaper prices. In fact, so much of the textiles, banking, and mercantile business were deeply connected to the Southern cotton trade, and there was even a movement to have New York State secede from the Union and join the South. Economics indeed played a huge part in the start of the Civil War. But also at issue were the facts that the U.S. military often failed to protect citizens in areas contested by Native Americans, especially in the West and in Texas and the Oklahoma Territory, yet the government still collected taxes. Another factor that often escapes most Americans is that Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri were Union states that were also slave states, and Delaware maintained the highest number of registered slave owners in the nation. Attempts at compromise followed, but Lincoln and the Republicans rejected the proposed Crittenden Compromise, which would have allowed slavery to be maintained in perpetuity in those states and territories where it still existed as a federal law and unable to ever be eradicated by Congress. South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had already seceded by February. In March 1861, 7 Southern states had seceded from the Union, and by April 12, 1861, the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was under siege from Confederate shore batteries. Both President Buchanan and President-elect Lincoln refused to recognize the Confederacy, declaring it illegal. The Confederate States then elected Jefferson Davis as their president on February 9, 1861. Lincoln did offer a compromise when he supported the Corwin Amendment to the Constitution, which passed both houses of Congress and was awaiting ratification by the states when Lincoln took office. This would have established slavery as a permanent legal condition in those states and territories where it already existed, free from federal challenges. On March 4, 1861, in his first inaugural address, Lincoln said that because he holds such a provision to now be implied constitutional law, I have no objection to it being made express and irrevocable. Just before the war, Lincoln sent a letter to every governor stating that Congress had passed a joint resolution to amend the Constitution. On February 11, 1861, Lincoln left Springfield for the last time. Due to suspected assassination plots, he had heavy security and managed to avoid contact with assassins in Baltimore. So concerned for his security, he was advised to change clothes, and on February 23, 1861, he arrived in Washington, D.C. in disguise. In giving his inaugural address to the South on March 4, 1861, he stated, that he had no inclination to abolish slavery in the Southern states. Quote, apprehension seems to exist among the people of the Southern states that by the accession, a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be by better angels of our nature. This unwillingness to expand slavery, as well as regulate Southern commerce abroad, to the benefit of Northern businesses and to the detriment of Southern cotton and tobacco growers, became the sources of conflict between Northern and Southern states. Lincoln discussed the growing problem with his trusted advisors and stated, quote, both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. Lincoln's allies, the pro-war anti-slavery Democrats and the radical Republicans, wanted a harsh military response to the Confederates, while the anti-war secessionist Democrats, known as Copperheads, wanted him at least removed from office, if not dead, for refusing to allow the Southern states to secede. Historian Allen Nevins argued that the newly inaugurated Lincoln made three miscalculations. He underestimated the gravity of the crisis, exaggerating the strength of Unionist sentiment in the South, and overlooking Southern Unionist opposition to an invasion. General William Tecumseh Sherman met with Lincoln during Inauguration Week and was sadly disappointed at his failure to realize that the country was sleeping on a volcano and the South was preparing for war. The new President Lincoln responded to the crisis-wielding powers as no other president before him. He distributed $2 million from the Treasury for war materiel without an appropriation from Congress. He called for 75,000 volunteers into military service without a declaration of war to recapture forts, protect Washington, and preserve the Union. As Northern states sent Union regiments south, on April 19th, Confederate sympathizers in Baltimore attacked Union troops who were changing trains and critical rail bridges to the capital, and the Army responded by arresting local Maryland officials. As a result of this and other pending actions, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus as stated in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2 of the Constitution in an effort to protect the troops trying to reach Washington. Some scholars say that this was a clear and unlawful violation of the protection that protects citizens against unlawful and indefinite imprisonment without having access to a judge and knowing the charges against them. However, there is a stipulation that the federal governments, meaning the president, may invoke the action in case of war, conflict, or insurrection. John Merryman, one of the Maryland officials arrested and held, petitioned Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney to issue a writ of habeas corpus. In June, in Ex parte Merryman, Taney, giving his decision and not reflective of the Supreme Court in total, issued the writ. He believed that Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution only authorized Congress and not the President to suspend habeas corpus. But Lincoln disagreed with the ruling, with the policy thereby allowing for the arrest and imprisonment of suspected Confederate sympathizers without a warrant. However, Lincoln's decision met with so much political fire that he actually sent the request to Congress where it was affirmed. Lincoln closely supervised the strategy and tactics in the war effort. In fact, he took direct command and control, including the selection of generals, and implemented a naval blockade of the South's ports, interdicting trade, and averted British intervention by defusing the Trent Affair, which threatened war with Great Britain. This was when the U.S. Navy illegally intercepted a British mail ship, the HMS Trent, on the high seas in 1861 and seized 2 Confederate diplomats. Britain protested the hostile act, which threatened to bring the United Kingdom into the war supporting the Confederacy. The radical Republicans criticized Lincoln for moving too slowly in abolishing slavery. On August 6, 1861, General John C. Fremont took it upon his own authority without consulting Lincoln to order the Confiscation Act that authorized judicial proceedings to confiscate and free slaves who were used to support the Confederates. Lincoln canceled the illegal proclamation as being politically motivated and lacking military necessity. Lincoln believed that the law had little practical effect, but it did provide some political support for abolishing slavery. In 1860, Congress finally passed the Homestead Act, but it was vetoed by Democratic President James Buchanan. Southerners were opposed to it, believing it would result in anti-slavery people settling the territories. Employers were concerned that it would destroy the labor market by losing workers, which would increase wages. Lincoln made another tactical error when he finally signed the Homestead Act into law on May 20, 1862, which gave each person who filed a claim 160 acres if they followed certain rules for improving the land. This would place a human wave of settlers flooding into traditional Native American lands, something which many scholars argue is illegal for even Congress to do without consultation and treaty negotiations with the various Indian tribes in question. Naturally, the respective Indian tribes were not consulted, and hundreds of thousands of people fled west, including over 25,000 freed slaves and thousands of runaways from the South. They flooded into Oklahoma, Kansas, Alaska, Minnesota, Arizona, California, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming and the Dakotas, creating another problem. The local Native Americans were forced back and off their natural hunting lands, and the Sioux Nation in particular rose in response, and in August 1862, the Dakota War exploded. After several weeks of fighting, a military commission, composed of officers from the Minnesota Volunteer Infantry, sentenced 303 Dakota men to death. Lincoln reviewed the convictions and approved death sentences for 39 out of the 303 Indians. The stage was set for decades of future conflict between settlers and the various Indian tribes. Lincoln chose his generals according to several criteria: success in the field, ability to follow his orders, and their political leanings. He fired and appointed field commanders as easily as ordering from a menu, and one example was General George B. McClellan, the former commander of the Army of the Potomac. For more than a year, the lack of Union success saw morale plummet, damaging strong support for a reunification of the nation. The narrow Union victory at Antietam on September 22, 1862, gave the North hope. This victory gave Lincoln the confidence to officially and publicly change his war objectives. On that day, he issued his Emancipation Proclamation that slaves in Confederate states would be set free as of January 1, 1863. The Army and Navy were ordered to, quote, recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons and to receive them into the armed service of the United States. Lincoln pressured the border states to outlaw slavery, and he proposed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery except as punishment for serious crimes. The Emancipation Proclamation could not be enforced in the Confederacy and didn't apply to border states, including Tennessee and a few Louisiana parishes. For the first time, blacks were now allowed to serve in the Union Army under white officers, greatly enhancing Union numbers, and paved the way for the passage of the 13th Amendment that ended legal slavery. Not everyone in the Union was on board, and the proclamation sparked protest among workers in the city, as well as soldiers and officers in New York regiments who had signed up to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. The Union Army did enforce the proclamation as it took control of Confederate territories. However, it took more than 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation for Western Texas slaves to be freed on June 19, 1865. This is celebrated as Juneteenth. But Lincoln had another major problem that challenged his leadership. When in early 1863, Congress passed a strict new conscription law, which made all male citizens between 20 and 35 and all unmarried men between 35 and 45 subject to military duty. This was not welcomed, especially when a new twist in the law became well known. All eligible men were entered into a lottery, but they could buy their way out of harm's way by hiring a substitute or paying $300 to the government, roughly $5,800 today. The hardest hit were the large numbers of Irish immigrants who worked in factories, shipping, and other industries who could never afford to pay the exemption. At that time, $300 was a yearly salary for the average American worker, making avoiding the draft impossible for poor people, allowing the wealthy to avoid service. Compounding the issue, blacks were exempt from the draft, as they were not considered citizens, but they could volunteer. The anti-war newspapers attacked the new draft law, pointing out the disparity between rich and poor, which only increased the anger of white workers as they waited for the city's first draft lottery on July 11, 1863. As a result, on July 13, 1863, the New York draft riots erupted for over 5 days, becoming one of the bloodiest and most destructive riots in American history. Detroit and Boston also had riots, but New York was the largest and worst. The violence saw hundreds of people killed and many more seriously injured, and black New Yorkers were often the target of the rioters' violence. Black workers were attacked, especially those working on the docks, along with the poor whites, who would have to fight, knowing that the blacks could remain at their jobs and not have to serve, which meant they made more money. Many blacks were lynched or beaten to death. On July 15th, more than 4,000 federal troops from New York regiments were sent who had been fighting in the Battle of Gettysburg to stop the violence, although the Republican mayor, George Opdyke, would not declare martial law. In all, the official published death toll of the New York City riots was 119 people, although later estimates had the number of people killed as high as 1,200. Race relations took a nosedive, and Lincoln was solely responsible. Over 3,000 black families had been burned out and made homeless. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address to a crowd of around 15,000 people, where he said that the battle fought 4 months earlier was, quote, the ultimate test of the preservation of the Union created in 1776, and the people who died at Gettysburg fought to uphold this cause, end quote. A common interpretation was that the president was expanding the cause of the Civil War from simply reunifying the Union to also fighting for equality and abolishing slavery. By 1864, the Confederacy had not suffered any major defeats outside of Gettysburg, and Lincoln believed that he would be a one-term president. George B. McClellan challenged him for the presidency, but Lincoln received 55% of the popular vote and 212 of 243 electoral votes. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Virginia, surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, ending the war. Reconstruction had already begun as early as 1863 in areas firmly under Union military control, and Lincoln always favored a policy of rapid reunification without retribution. Lincoln was confronted by Republicans in Congress who wanted severe punishment, total sworn allegiance, financial compensation, and repentance from former Confederates. Before any political base had any chance to firmly develop, Lincoln was assassinated. Some scholars doubt that the Union would have been preserved had another person of lesser character been in the White House, and that is probably true. According to historian Michael Burlingame, quote, no president in history ever faced a greater crisis, and no president ever accomplished as much. Lincoln's philosophy was perhaps best summed up in his second inaugural address when he stated, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Lincoln exceeded his authority on several occasions, but it would appear that he did so for the greater good, although many of the results were disastrous. He could have been impeached. Was he corrupt? We leave it to you to decide. Every national and world leader is judged by their policies and actions, and some are treated harshly during their tenure and afterward by history. In some cases, historical research and hindsight reassesses their role in either a positive or a negative light. U.S. presidents are no exception, and Herbert Hoover was a man of many contradictions, but he was a man of his time, and in some ways ahead of his time. Some of his actions have been praised as extraordinary on a humanitarian level, while other actions caused some to demonize him. Let's look at his career and examine both arguments. Who was Herbert Hoover? Why was he controversial to some and praised by others? What actions did he take to try and help humanity? What did he do to cause so many to detest him?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Herbert Hoover was born on August 10, 1874, in West Branch, Iowa, into a Quaker family, but he grew up in Oregon. He was later one of the first graduates of the newly established Stanford University in 1895. Hoover became a mining expert and worked in the Sierra Nevada mountains following a period of low-wage excavation. Mining engineer Louis Janin hired him as a mine scout due to his expertise in detecting high-grade ore. Hoover spent a year inspecting and selecting locations for mines until he was recruited by the London-based mining company Bewick Moring and Company, which had gold mines in Australia. Hoover was paid a $5,000 salary, equivalent to about $200,120 today, working in the Coolgardie and Murchison of the Great Victoria Desert, where evaluating mines for quality and safety was his job. He was able to persuade the Bewick Company to purchase the Sons of Gwalia gold mine. Later, it became one of the most successful gold mines in Australia. Due to the rising labor disputes with local miners, Hoover brought in many Italian immigrants, reducing operating costs and avoiding labor strikes. It was during this time that he developed his opposition to workers' compensation packages and minimum wage scales as they cut into corporate profits. For his efforts, he was made a junior partner in 1898, working for the manager, Ernest Williams. While in Australia, Hoover also co-founded the Zinc Corporation near Broken Hill, New South Wales, where he developed the froth flotation process used to extract zinc from lead-silver ore, becoming the world's first selective ore differential flotation plant. Hoover later took a consulting job in China, where he established gold mines near Tianjin for Bewick and the Chinese Engineering and Mining Company. Hoover warned his superiors that, quote, Chinese workers were inefficient and racially inferior, but made recommendations to improve the lot of the Chinese worker, seeking to end the practice of imposing long-term servitude contracts and to institute reforms for workers based on merit. End quote. Hoover found himself trapped with hundreds of other foreigners when the Boxer Rebellion began. See our video on that subject and legendary Marine Daniel Daly at the Battle of Tien Tsin. Once effective control was reestablished in China, Hoover was appointed as the operating partner in late 1901. Given his expertise, Hoover assisted the British Burma Corporation that produced silver, lead, and zinc at the Nam Tu Baldwin mine,
He later went to Russia and helped increase copper production in Kyiv, Russia, through the use of pyritic smelting. Hoover also supervised mining operations in the Altai Mountains that, according to Hoover, developed probably the greatest and richest single body of ore known in the world. Hoover was also very business savvy, and he made smart investments all over the world with offices in London, New York City, Paris, San Francisco, Petrograd, modern-day Leningrad, several locations in Australia, and in Mandalay, Burma. By 1914, Hoover was a very wealthy man with an estimated personal fortune of $4 million, which is about $121.67 million in today's money. After seeing the hard, back-breaking work of the miners, Hoover changed his opinion on labor and came to endorse 8-hour workdays and organized labor. He wanted workers to have rights. When World War I broke out in 1914, Hoover organized and headed the Commission for Relief in Belgium, one of many international relief organizations that provided food to occupied Belgium, while also serving as President Woodrow Wilson's director of the U.S. Food Administration, and he also served as the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. See our video on Woodrow Wilson also. Hoover even traveled to Europe and diplomatically negotiated with the British, French, and even the Germans to allow famine relief to enter Belgium until 1917, when the U.S. declared war on the Central Powers. Some of Hoover's detractors later insinuated that he made secret deals to increase his own personal wealth at the expense of the starving Belgians, but no evidence has ever surfaced to prove that. He was already one of the richest men in America anyway. When World War I ended, Hoover led the American Relief Administration, providing food to millions of people who were starving in Central and Eastern Europe. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept blame for the war, although Germany did not start it, and was still forced to pay reparations until 1984. To Woodrow Wilson's and Hoover's credit, they opposed the imposition of the reparations and guilt clause imposed upon Germany, who alone was being financially punished. They both saw a future crisis in the making, and they were right. Hyperinflation and food shortages were the result, the rise of communism and National Socialism, and 15 nations involved in the war owed huge sums of money that they had borrowed from the United States. Britain and France were the two largest debtors. The French claimed that they would pay their debts with reparations money from Germany. The U.S. found this unacceptable, as reparations and war debts were two separate issues. The American public, as well as the bankers who funded the war and were the real reason Woodrow Wilson took America into the war to protect those investments, demanded that Allied nations repay what they borrowed, regardless of Germany's reparations. However, France and Great Britain finally admitted that without reparations from Germany, which included taking all of the coal, iron, and precious minerals which Germany did not have an abundance of, they would not be able to pay off their debts. Hoover condemned the Bolshevik Revolution and warned President Wilson against becoming involved in the Russian Civil War, as he viewed the White Russian forces little better than the Bolsheviks and feared the possibility of a protracted U.S. involvement. Hoover's financial and political positions, as well as his wartime humanitarian service, made him a favorite of many progressives, and he unsuccessfully sought the Republican nomination in the 1920 U.S. presidential election. However, he was unsuccessful in that bid, but other challenges presented themselves. According to varying estimates, the Russian famine of 1921-22 resulting from World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Russian Civil War that followed claimed 6 million people, but Hoover again jumped into action. His managing the ARA likely saved millions of lives, although once again his detractors accused him of being a communist sympathizer, and when he was asked if he was not helping the communists, Hoover stated, 20 million people are starving. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed. All of the European nations gave him credit for saving lives, and in July 1922, the Soviet author Maxim Gorky told Hoover that Your help will enter history as a unique, gigantic achievement, worthy of the greatest glory, which will long remain in the memory of millions of Russians whom you have saved from death." By 1924, the German economy was collapsing and endangering the international financial system. The Allies agreed to a commission chaired by American banker and politician Charles Dawes as a remedy. The resulting Dawes Plan reduced German reparations payments and encouraged U.S. banks to loan money to Germany to help rebuild German industry, on the assumption that a stronger German economy would make the reparations payments more manageable. Then Hoover became the Secretary of Commerce and promoted the use of radios in homes, and he played a key role in the organization, development, and regulation of radio broadcasting. One of Hoover's more controversial moments was when he helped pass the Radio Act of 1927. This allowed the government to intervene and abolish radio stations that were deemed non-useful to the public. In effect, strict censorship and regulation. This saw massive resistance from members of both houses of Congress as well as the independent radio station owners. Hoover once again became involved during the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, which broke the banks and levees of the lower Mississippi Valley in early 1927, resulting in the flooding of millions of acres and leaving 1.5 million people displaced from their homes. The Commerce Department was not legally responsible for disaster relief, but the governors of 6 states along the Mississippi River specifically asked President Calvin Coolidge to appoint Hoover to coordinate the response to the flood. Coolidge agreed that it was not a federal responsibility, and he refused to have government involvement at first, until public and political pressure became intense, and he then appointed Hoover to chair a special committee to help the region. In response, Hoover established over 110 cities and a fleet of more than 600 vessels and raised $17 million, which is equivalent to $300 million today. Hoover was praised for addressing the crisis, but he was later condemned for suppressing the reports of blacks being abused in refugee camps. Hoover was supported in this suppression by black leader Robert Russell Moulton, who was promised unprecedented influence once Hoover became president. Hoover's enemies claimed that he was bribing prominent blacks to tamp down the segregation and violence against blacks, who were abused economically and even legally. As president, he signed the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1929, establishing the Federal Farm Board in order to stabilize farm prices, which was not universally well received. Hoover had also campaigned on America not getting involved in foreign conflicts, and when he became president, he released the Clark Memorandum, a rejection of the Roosevelt Corollary and a move towards non-interventionism in Latin America. But Hoover still intervened in the Dominican Republic and sent warships to El Salvador to support the government against a left-wing revolution. But Hoover did manage to end America's involvement in the Banana Wars, ending the occupation of Nicaragua and nearly bringing an end to the occupation of Haiti. Hoover wanted to develop privately owned commercial air travel, which was growing in Europe and would be indirectly supported by government subsidies. Part of that was the creation of emergency landing fields, improving safety by airport runways required to be equipped with lights and radio beams, and encouraging farmers to make use of planes for crop dusting. Hoover also helped establish the early Federal Aviation Administration, which gave the federal government the responsibility to inspect planes and license pilots, and he oversaw the growth of military aviation. A global financial crisis was looming by 1929, and American industrialist businessman Owen D. Young agreed to reduce German war payments. The other major threat was excessive speculation that had raised stock prices far beyond their value. Coolidge and Hoover were warned that a failure to curb speculation would lead to one of the greatest financial catastrophes that this country has ever seen. But both presidents were reluctant to become involved with the workings of the Federal Reserve System created by Woodrow Wilson, which regulated banks. The stock market collapse forced Hoover to take immediate action, and he gathered business and labor leaders, asking them to avoid wage cuts and work stoppages while the country faced what he believed would be a short recession similar to the Depression of 1920 and 21. In another desperate move, Hoover persuaded the railroads and public utilities to increase spending on public construction and maintenance projects, while the Federal Reserve promised to cut interest rates to relieve the pressure. Hoover secured $100 million from Congress to continue the Federal Farm Board lending and purchasing policies, designed to prevent a cycle of deflation and provide a fiscal stimulus. But Hoover then opposed congressional proposals to provide federal relief to the unemployed. Hoover did not believe that the federal government should become a welfare provider, and such reliefs were the responsibilities of the state and local governments and philanthropic organizations. Hoover signed the Republican-sponsored Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law in June 1930, although he was not totally supportive of the legislation and opposed by leading economists. As expected, many nations, especially Canada, France, and Great Britain, retaliated by also raising tariffs on American goods, which weakened the global economy further. Progressive Republicans such as Senator William E. Borah of Idaho were outraged when Hoover signed the Tariff Act, and Hoover's relations with that wing of the party never recovered. Hoover sought to cut immigration to the United States to reduce unemployment, and in 1930 he issued his executive order requiring individuals to have employment before migrating to the United States. Well, times have changed, haven't they? The prosecution of illegal immigrants, which began, most strongly affected Mexican Americans, especially those living in Southern California. Many of the deportations were overseen by state and local authorities who acted on the encouragement of the Hoover administration. Around 1 million Mexican Americans were returned to Mexico, and apparently around 60% were birthright citizens. Citing legal professor Kevin R. Johnson, the repatriation campaign meets the modern legal standards of ethnic cleansing, as it involved the forced removal by a racial minority by government actors. This was one of the many accusations leveled at Hoover. Hoover wanted near total military disarmament to use federal money for domestic projects. Hoover and Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson wanted to extend the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty established to prevent a global naval arms race. The major naval powers signed the 1930 London Naval Treaty, which was the first time that the world's naval powers agreed to cap their tonnage of all ships being built, as previous agreements had only affected capital ships. Hoover proposed more reductions in armaments to include banning of tanks and bomber aircraft at the 1932 World Disarmament Conference, but his proposals were not adopted. The collapse of the Austrian bank Kreditanstalt in May 1931 was just one more blow to the world markets and sent shockwaves throughout Europe and the international financial system. The German financial system was already on life support, and with reparations, their collapse meant that France and Great Britain would be unable to pay their war debts to the U.S. government, while at the same time, German default on the private sector industrial loans would bring down the U.S. banking system. Hoover saw what was coming, and in June 1931 called for a one-year pause in all international debt payments. This move had saved the entire international banking system from collapsing, but it only bought some time. Hoover's darkest legacy was perhaps the Bonus Army debacle, when thousands of World War I veterans and their families demonstrated and camped out in Washington, D.C. during June 1932. Hoover issued the order to peacefully disband them. See our video on the Bonus Army. Douglas MacArthur was in command, and he believed it was a communist revolt against the government, and he chose to clear out the camp with military force. Though Hoover had not directly ordered MacArthur's clearing out of the protesters, he endorsed it after the fact. The incident proved somewhat embarrassing for the Hoover administration and seriously hurt his bid for re-election. After Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, Hoover took a hands-off approach while openly dissenting, fearing that such a position would weaken relations and reduce Japan as a possible ally against the Soviets. In response, Hoover and Secretary of State Stimson outlined the Stimson Doctrine, which held that the United States would not recognize territories gained by force. It should be acknowledged that neither President Calvin Coolidge nor Herbert Hoover recognized the Soviet Union as a legitimate country due to the Bolshevik Revolution. Meanwhile, as the Great Depression worsened, the country's homeless population increased, unemployment reached 23%, and Hoover was blamed. Shanty towns and tent cities were called Hoovervilles, and Hoover leather was the name given to cardboard used to cover the soles of shoes, while Hoover blankets were old newspapers used as blankets. Being resistant to federal intervention, in January 1932, Hoover finally convinced Congress to authorize the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Such projects that resulted included the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. This provided government-secured loans to financial institutions, railroads, and local governments, and saved numerous businesses from failure, but it failed to stimulate commercial lending as much as Hoover had hoped, partly because it was run by conservative bankers unwilling to make riskier loans. Hoover then signed the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, establishing 12 district banks overseen by a Federal Home Loan Bank Board in a manner similar to the Federal Reserve System. Hoover then pushed the Glass-Steagall Act of 1932, which was designed to extend banking credit by expanding the collateral on which Federal Reserve banks were authorized to lend. When all of these programs failed, Hoover signed the $2 billion Public Emergency Relief and Construction Act in July 1932, creating more work projects to decrease unemployment, such as the Hoover Dam. Hoover tried to stave off a default by any of the major economies and prop up the U.S. banking sector, while attempting to address rising unemployment and the collapse of American agriculture at home, but it was a losing battle. Hoover proposed a tax plan to increase tax revenues by 30% in 1931, which became the Revenue Act of 1932, increasing taxes across the board. The nation's top earners paid 63% on net income, and the top estate tax rate was doubled. This alienated the very wealthy from Hoover and the Republicans. Personal income tax exemptions were drastically reduced, and the corporate income tax exemption was eliminated, while corporate taxes increased, but the deficit still rose. This all also alienated big businesses, driving them into the Democratic camp in the coming election. Hoover was not an avowed racist, despite his previous references to the contrary, as he believed that blacks could improve themselves with education and individual initiative. In fact, Hoover appointed more minorities, especially blacks, to more federal positions than either Presidents Harding and Coolidge combined. But many African American leaders condemned various aspects of the Hoover administration, including Hoover's unwillingness to push for a federal anti-lynching law. But Hoover also removed blacks from leadership positions in the Republican Party, trying to end the Democratic Party's dominance in the South. Despite Robert Moton and other black leaders agreeing to this move as a temporary measure, most African American leaders were outraged. Hoover, like many in his day, considered whites to be inherently intellectually superior to blacks and that interracial marriages were bad. He did think education and work would improve black people's standing, hence his support for the Tuskegee Institute as a black college. It was under Hoover that the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was begun in 1932 and conducted by the United States Public Health Service, although without congressional approval. This program lasted until it was abolished by President Richard M. Nixon. See our 2 videos on him. W.E.B. Du Bois described Hoover as an undemocratic racist who saw blacks as a species of sub-men. Hoover's nomination of North Carolina Judge John J. Parker to the Supreme Court further alienated black leaders. but Parker's nomination died in the Senate due to opposition from the NAACP and organized labor. As a result, many black voters switched to the Democratic Party in 1932, along with wealthy business owners, and they helped Franklin Roosevelt win that election. By December 1932, both Britain and France announced that they would likely be unable to make their next debt payments. And on December 14th, the French Chamber of Deputies made it official. France was not able to repay their loans. Hoover's anti-business positions and the perception that he was favoring well-connected banks over the common man saw Republican House Representative Lewis Thomas McFadden of Pennsylvania, who was best known for the 1927 McFadden Act, which helped national banks better compete with state-chartered banks, twice call for the impeachment of President Hoover. He also charged Hoover for overstepping his constitutional role and mishandling the international debts following World War I. McFadden's impeachment resolution included charges of endeavoring to illegally cancel the war debts, undertaking secret conversations with foreign bankers, violating the Constitution by seeking to usurp Congress's role in foreign policy and finance. It also included the charges of inflicting suffering on the American people through the moratorium for the benefit of the debtor nations, as well as Hoover's federal appointments that McFadden himself personally disapproved of, and Hoover's handling of the bonus Army veterans. The impeachment proceedings were tabled in the House of Representatives and died a natural death because 6 weeks later, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. Hoover strongly criticized Roosevelt's foreign policy and the New Deal. Afterward, Hoover's image was elevated in the 1940s and 50s due to his work in the Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower administrations, which included chairing the Hoover Commission. The Great Depression had been blamed mostly on Hoover, although those seeds were planted long before he became president. Due to the heavy pressures worldwide, every nation that owed the U.S. had defaulted on their obligations, with exception to Finland. Hoover could have done nothing about it. Hoover's reelection campaign was faced with perhaps the most hostile crowds ever seen by a sitting president, as his train and motorcades were pelted with eggs and rotten fruit. He was often heckled while speaking, and on several occasions, the Secret Service halted attempts to harm him. One event included the Secret Service capturing a man coming near Hoover carrying sticks of dynamite, and another already having removed several spikes from the rails in the front of the president's train. Hoover was blamed for every failure in the country, and in the electoral vote, Hoover lost 59 to 472, carrying only 6 states. Hoover won 39.6% of the popular vote, a plunge of 18.6 percentage points from his result in the 1920 election. Hoover remained active in politics for many years and backed conservative Robert A. Taft in the 1952 Republican National Convention, but Dwight D. Eisenhower won that presidential nomination and also the 1952 election. President John F. Kennedy offered Hoover various positions in his administration, which he declined, but he defended Kennedy following the Bay of Pigs invasion. See our video on that event also. In retirement, Hoover wrote several books, including The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson, where he defended Wilson's actions at the Paris Peace Conference, believing that if Wilson had been supported by the Senate, World War II could have been averted, and your humble narrator believes that is very viable. In 1944, he began working on Freedom Betrayed, where he criticized Roosevelt's foreign policy, especially Roosevelt's decision to recognize the Soviet Union in order to provide aid to that country during World War II. He was also critical of FDR's gold confiscation policy. Historian Richard Pipes commented on Hoover's efforts while leading the American Relief Administration. Quote, "Many statesmen occupy a prominent place in history for having sent millions to their death. Herbert Hoover, maligned for his performance as president and soon forgotten in Russia, has the rare distinction of having saved millions. Hoover has been called a humanitarian, a globalist, a racist, a bigot, a savior, and an icon, depending upon the sources. All said and done, he was a man of his times, and it would appear that, for all of his faults, he was considerably better than some, but we will let you decide. Herbert Hoover died in New York City on October 20th, 1964, following massive internal bleeding due to intestinal cancer. He was both revered and reviled from both sides of the political aisle. History will eventually be the final judge.
Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.